Northern Colorado, January 1887. The temperature had dropped to 11 below zero. Across Larimer County, families huddled near their fireplaces, feeding log after log into flames that barely held back the killing cold. In conventional cabins, frost crept across interior walls. Children slept in coats. Livestock perished in their pens. But at the edge of the Poudre River Valley, inside a structure the neighbors called Brennan's Folly, something impossible was happening. While others burned through their winter wood stores in desperate haste, one man sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves, a single small fire glowing in the corner. His cabin, round, low, and buried beneath 2 feet of prairie hay, held steady at 57 degrees Fahrenheit. No heroic stoking, no midnight runs to the woodpile, just quiet, persistent warmth that defied every rule the frontier builders thought they knew. What did this Irish rancher understand about heat retention that experienced carpenters, masons, and settlers had missed? And why had they laughed at him right up until the moment winter proved them catastrophically wrong? Before we reveal how he did it, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Do that now, and I promise you'll walk away with knowledge that could save your life, or at least your heating bill, this winter. We read every single comment. Spring 1886. Fort Collins, Colorado Territory. When Declan Brennan announced his building plans at McKinley's General Store, the laughter started before he'd finished speaking. A round cabin, covered in hay like some kind of oversized haystack? The weathered ranchers and carpenters gathered around the pot-bellied stove, exchanged glances that needed no words. Brennan's lost his mind, muttered Wesley Croft, a carpenter who'd built 17 cabins in the valley. Round walls can't support a proper roof. And hey, might as well invite every mouse and spark in the county to your funeral. But Declan Brennan wasn't mad. He was desperate, and desperation had made him observant. He'd spent his first Colorado winter in a standard log cabin, chinked, properly squared, built exactly like every other structure for 50 miles. He'd burned 4 cords of wood between November and March. His wife, Catherine, had developed a persistent cough from sleeping in rooms that dropped to 35 degrees by dawn. Their infant daughter had survived, but barely. Brennan had watched families lose children that winter. He'd seen men work themselves to exhaustion just keeping fires fed. And he'd noticed something the others hadn't. The old beaver lodge at the bend in the river. Buried in mud and sticks, insulated by water and earth, it maintained a temperature warm enough that steam rose from its entrance even on the coldest mornings. Nature, he reasoned, had already solved the problem. Engineers just refused to see it. So Brennan began sketching. A circular structure, 8 feet tall at the center, 22 feet across. Walls of stacked prairie sod, 2 feet thick. Roof timbers radiating from a central post, covered first with canvas, then with compressed hay bales stacked 2 feet deep, then sealed with more sod. A small corner firebox made of river stone. Minimal windows. A low, east-facing door. When he showed the plans to his neighbors, their mockery intensified. "You'll suffocate in there," predicted Henry Caldwell, who fancied himself the settlement's resident expert on ventilation. "No proper chimney, walls too thick. It's a tomb, not a home." Catherine stood beside him, 7 months pregnant with their second child, and said simply, "Build it." By late August, the roundhouse stood complete at the edge of Brennan's 40-acre claim. Neighbors rode past slowly, shaking their heads. Some called it the mushroom, others, less charitably, Brennan's burrow. Children dared each other to knock on the door. The settlement had rendered its verdict. Declan Brennan was a fool, and winter would prove it. What the neighbors saw as lunacy, Brennan understood as physics. The round design wasn't aesthetic, it was aerodynamic. Winter winds in northern Colorado routinely hit 40 miles per hour, driving cold deep into every corner, every gap, every perpendicular surface. Square cabins presented flat faces to those winds, creating dead zones where cold air pooled and pressed. A circular structure shed wind the way a river stone sheds current, offering no corners for cold to accumulate, no flat surfaces to batter. But the real genius lay in the hay. Prairie hay, properly dried and compressed, trapped thousands of tiny air pockets within its stems and seed heads. Air, Brennan had learned from an engineer passing through on the railroad survey, was one of nature's finest insulators when it couldn't move. The 2-foot blanket of hay covering his roof and upper walls created what modern building science would later call an R-value of approximately 40, more than 8 times that of standard log walls. The thick sod walls, 2 feet of packed earth and root systems, provided what Brennan thought of as steadiness, while log walls conducted outside cold inward and inside heat outward. Earth absorbed and held temperature. The thermal mass of nearly 12 tons of soil meant the walls themselves became a heat battery, slowly releasing overnight whatever warmth the day or the firebox provided. His corner firebox, built from river sandstone, embodied the same principle. Unlike iron stoves that heated fast and cooled fast, the 800-pound stone firebox absorbed heat from even a small fire and radiated it for hours after the flames died. Brennan had sized it deliberately small, just 18 inches wide, 2 feet deep, because he didn't need blast furnace heat. He needed persistent, even warmth. The ventilation, everyone mocked, carefully calculated. A 4-inch chimney pipe, adequate for a small fire, but minimal in heat loss. A 6-inch vent hole at the roof's peak, controlled by a wooden slide, allowing moisture and smoke to escape without hemorrhaging warmth. The low door, opening east, sheltered from prevailing northwest winds. Every element served thermal retention. No wasted height to heat and use space. No large windows bleeding warmth into the night. No decorative features that compromised insulation. Brennan had built what modern survivalists would recognize as a near-perfect passive heating shelter. But in 1886 Colorado, it looked like the dwelling of a man who'd given up on civilization. When he tried to explain the principles to Wesley Croft, conduction, radiation, thermal mass, the carpenter cut him off. "You're putting fancy words to foolishness, Brennan. Come January, you'll be begging for shelter in a real cabin." Brennan simply smiled and continued stacking firewood. He'd need far less than they thought. By October, the settlement's skepticism had hardened into certainty. The criticism came from all quarters, each expert confident in their particular domain of knowledge. Wesley Croft declared the structure unsound, sod walls settle. They crack. Come spring, if you survive the winter, you'll have gaps wide enough to throw a cat through. He predicted total structural failure by March. Henry Caldwell, the ventilation expert, grew more strident as temperatures dropped. At a Sunday gathering, he held forth for 20 minutes on the dangers of confined spaces. Oxygen depletion, he warned, jabbing his finger toward Brennan. You've built a suffocation chamber. That fire will consume what little air you've trapped inside those hay bales, and your family will simply stop breathing in their sleep. The county's visiting physician, Dr. Marcus Thornhill, added medical authority to the condemnation. Excessive moisture from breathing and cooking, trapped by your seal design, will breed miasmas and lung disorders. I've seen it in poorly ventilated mining camps. Your wife's cough will worsen, and your children. He shook his head gravely. I strongly advise alternative shelter. Even the local minister, Reverend Samuel Whitmore, weighed in, though his concerns were more philosophical. God gave us forests for timber and the skill to square logs, he intoned during a sermon that everyone knew was aimed at Brennan. There's a reason civilized people don't live in dirt mounds like prairie dogs. We're called to rise above nature, not burrow into it. The women of the settlement worried most vocally about Catherine. 7 months pregnant, she'd moved into the roundhouse in early October while Declan completed the hay covering. She'll birth that baby in the dark and cold, predicted Martha Croft, Wesley's wife. No proper windows, no room for midwife to work. It's not just foolish, it's cruel. But perhaps the most damning assessment came from James Fitzpatrick, an Irish stonemason who'd worked on buildings from Denver to Cheyenne. He examined Brennan's corner firebox and declared it criminally inadequate. You need a proper fireplace, man. 6 feet wide, 4 feet deep, drawing a real chimney. This toy stove of yours couldn't heat a chicken coop in a Colorado winter. You've 800 cubic feet of space in there. You need at least a quart of wood a month just to maintain survivable temperatures. This, he kicked at the small firebox. This is a death sentence dressed up as cleverness. When Fitzpatrick's assessment circulated, it acquired the weight of unassailable fact. A real stonemason, an expert in thermodynamics of fireplaces, had condemned Brennan's design. The settlement's consensus became complete. The round cabin was a failure waiting to happen, and Declan Brennan's stubbornness would likely cost his family their lives. By late November, with the first serious cold settling in, neighbors stopped mocking and started worrying. A collection was quietly organized to offer the Brennans shelter when, not if, the roundhouse proved uninhabitable. Declan heard about it and politely declined. "Keep your charity for those who will need it," he said. "Come January, you'll see." The neighbors thought he meant they'd see his folly. They had it exactly backward. January 11th, 1887, 4:47 a.m. The blizzard arrived with no warning, sweeping down from Wyoming with the weight of Arctic fury. By dawn, visibility had dropped to 0. The temperature plummeted to 11 below and kept falling. Wind speeds exceeded 50 miles per hour, driving snow horizontal, piling drifts 10 feet high against north-facing walls. Across Larimer County, the fight for survival began. In conventional cabins, families woke to ice forming on interior walls. The Croft household, despite Wesley's expert construction, registered 29 degrees Fahrenheit at floor level by 6 a.m. Wesley and his two oldest sons worked in shifts, feeding split pine and cottonwood into their large fireplace every 20 minutes. The flames roared, but the heat fled up the chimney or seeped through log chinks faster than it could warm a space. Henry Caldwell's cabin, with its properly engineered ventilation, became a wind tunnel. Drafts howled through deliberately placed vents, and despite blocking 3 of them with wadded blankets, the interior temperature never rose above 35 degrees. His children slept in the kitchen, closest to the cook stove, wrapped in every quilt the family owned. Dr. Thornhill, visiting a patient when the storm hit, found himself trapped in the settlement's boarding house. 7 people crowded into 2 rooms, the fireplace consuming wood so fast that by noon, men were venturing into the storm to raid the woodshed. Even burning furniture, they couldn't maintain 40 degrees. But at the edge of the Poudre River Valley, inside the structure everyone had condemned, something remarkable was unfolding. Catherine Brennan woke at 6:15 a.m., not from cold, but from the baby kicking. The roundhouse interior held at 54 degrees, warmer than any neighboring cabin, and Declan's fire had burned down to coals hours earlier. She could see her breath, yes, but faintly. The packed earth walls, having absorbed weeks of gentle heat, were releasing it slowly, steadily, while the 2-foot hay blanket above held that warmth like a thermos holds coffee. Declan rebuilt the fire, not a roaring blaze, but a modest flame in the corner firebox. Within 30 minutes, the temperature climbed to 57 degrees. He added 3 split logs, then waited. The river stone absorbed the heat, radiating it evenly. The round walls circulated air naturally, preventing cold spots. The hay above, compressed and dense, shed the screaming wind without transmitting its cold. By noon, the exterior temperature had dropped to 18 below 0. The Brennan roundhouse held steady at 59 degrees. Declan had burned perhaps 1/8 the wood his neighbors were consuming. The storm raged for 3 days. Subscribe now and hit that like button, because what happened next changed Frontier building forever. Drop a comment telling us, what's the coldest temperature you've survived? We want to hear your story. On the storm's second day, Wesley Croft made a desperate decision. His woodpile, which should have lasted until March, was half gone. His youngest daughter had stopped shivering, a dangerous sign. Wrapping her in blankets, he fought through waist-deep snow toward the only shelter he'd refused to acknowledge, Brennan's roundhouse. He pounded on the low door, ice crusted in his beard. Declan opened it, standing in his work shirt, a small fire glowing behind him. The interior temperature read 58 degrees. Wesley Croft, expert carpenter, stared in disbelief at what was now undeniable. The fool had been right all along. January 14th, 1887, the morning after the storm. When the wind finally died and the sun broke through, the settlement emerged to assess the damage. 3 cabins had lost sections of roof. Livestock losses were catastrophic, and every household faced the same grim arithmetic, with supplies meant to last until March were 2/3 depleted. But it was the temperature measurements that told the real story. James Fitzpatrick, the stonemason who'd condemned Brennan's firebox, arrived with a mercury thermometer he'd ordered from Chicago. Professional pride demanded he understand what had happened. What he discovered, documented in his own hand in a letter to the Denver Post, would circulate through mining camps and settlements across the West for the next 2 decades. Exterior temperature, 8 a.m., 6 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 14 degrees Celsius. Croft cabin interior, 32 degrees 0 degrees Celsius. Large fireplace roaring, consuming wood at approximately 1 log every 15 minutes. Estimated wood consumption over 3-day storm, 240 logs. Caldwell cabin interior, 28 degrees minus 2 degrees Celsius. Cook stove and fireplace both burning. Multiple ventilation points sealed. Estimated wood consumption, 200 logs. Brennan roundhouse interior, 56 degrees, 13 degrees Celsius. Corner firebox burning modestly. Estimated wood consumption, 30 logs. The thermal retention measurements were even more revealing. When Fitzpatrick asked Declan to let the fire die completely, then monitored the temperature decline, the roundhouse lost heat at a rate of 1.5 degrees per hour. The Croft cabin, by comparison, dropped 4 degrees per hour with its fire extinguished. The thermal mass differential was staggering. Fitzpatrick calculated that Brennan's design provided approximately 87% greater heat retention than conventional log construction. The round shape reduced wind-driven heat loss by an estimated 40%. The hay insulation, tested by pressing the thermometer against the underside of the roof structure, showed virtually zero temperature transfer even with exterior temperatures at 6 below zero. But the most damning statistic was fuel efficiency. Over the 3-day storm, Brennan had maintained a survivable, indeed comfortable, interior temperature while consuming 1/8 the firewood of his neighbors. Extrapolated across a full winter, his design would require approximately half a cord would compare to the 4 or 5 cords conventional cabins demanded. The financial implications were immediate. At 1887 prices, firewood cost roughly $4 per cord if you bought it, or represented 20 to 30 hours of labor if you cut it yourself. Brennan's design saved either $12 to $16 in cash or 80 to 120 hours of brutal labor per winter. For struggling homesteaders, that difference meant survival. Dr. Thornhill, examining Catherine and the children, found them healthier than families in conventional homes. The consistent temperature had prevented the respiratory stress caused by wild temperature fluctuations. Catherine's cough, the one he predicted would worsen, had improved. The miasmas he'd warned about never materialized. The small vent hole and chimney pipe provided adequate air exchange without sacrificing warmth. Even Reverend Whitmore found himself reconsidering. Perhaps, he admitted in a Sunday sermon 3 weeks later, wisdom sometimes wears unexpected forms. The Lord teaches through many means, including those we're tempted to dismiss. But it was Wesley Croft's concession that carried the most weight. Standing in Brennan's roundhouse, measuring its dimensions and materials, he said quietly, "I built 17 cabins in this valley. I thought I knew everything worth knowing about frontier construction." He paused, running his hand along the smooth sod wall. "Turns out I knew how to repeat what I'd been taught. You knew how to think." Brennan's response shaped what came next. "I'll show anyone who asks how to build this. No charge, no secrets. We're all trying to survive the same winter." By February 1887, 3 families were planning round, hay-covered cabins for the following summer. By 1890, at least 23 such structures dotted northern Colorado and southern Wyoming. Fitzpatrick himself designed a modified version, incorporating the thermal mass principle into more conventional rectangular buildings through thick stone walls and compressed straw insulation. The round cabin had become legitimate, its designer vindicated not through argument, but through measurement. The settlement's mockery had met the blizzard's mathematics and lost decisively. Spring 1889. Larimer County, Colorado. 2 years after the blizzard, the landscape of northern Colorado homesteading had quietly transformed. What began as one man's folly had become a recognized building method, spreading not through official channels or government endorsement, but through the oldest form of validation: survival. By late 1889, 17 round or modified round cabins, incorporating Brennan's thermal mass principles, stood within a 50-mile radius of Fort Collins. James Fitzpatrick had built for himself, each refining the original design. Some used stone walls instead of sod, achieving even greater thermal retention. Others experimented with compressed straw bales as insulation, finding them nearly as effective as hay and less attractive to rodents. The designs varied, but the core principles remained. Eliminate corners where cold could pool, maximize thermal mass in walls and heating elements, insulate ruthlessly, size fireplaces for retention rather than raw heat output. Wesley Croft, the carpenter who'd once led the mockery, became one of the method's most effective advocates. He'd rebuilt his own cabin, incorporating a rounded addition with 18-inch stone walls and straw bale roof insulation. His winterwood consumption dropped by 60%. More importantly, his family slept warm. "I spent 17 years building the same cabin over and over," he told newcomers seeking advice, "because I never stopped to ask if there was a better way." Brennan asked that question. We should have listened. The medical evidence supported the thermal stability Brennan had achieved. Dr. Thornhill, tracking illness rates over 3 winters, noted that families in thermally stable homes, round cabins, stone mass designs, and heavily insulated structures experience 40% fewer respiratory infections than those in conventional log cabins. Children in particular thrived when not subjected to the metabolic stress of sleeping in 30-degree rooms, then waking to overheated spaces near roaring fires. The economic impact rippled further. Families spending less time and money on firewood had more resources for livestock, seed, equipment. Women previously exhausted by the constant demands of fire tending had time for income-generating work: sewing, teaching, preserving food for sale. The 80 to 120 hours saved per winter translated directly into improved quality of life and financial stability. But perhaps the most significant shift was philosophical. Brennan's success had demonstrated that frontier wisdom wasn't just about endurance or brute force solutions. It was about observation, adaptation, and the willingness to learn from systems that had already solved the problems humans faced, whether beaver lodges, prairie dog burrows, or the earth itself. The round cabin never became the dominant architectural form. It was too unfamiliar, too visually strange for most settlers raised on rectangular buildings. But its principles infiltrated conventional construction. Thicker walls, better insulation, smaller, more efficient heating sources, attention to thermal mass. By 1895, even standard rectangular cabins in northern Colorado were being built with noticeably different priorities than those constructed a decade earlier. Declan Brennan himself never sought recognition beyond his immediate community. He ranched his 40 acres, raised 4 children in the roundhouse, and freely shared his methods with anyone who asked. When a Denver newspaper reporter traveled north to interview him in 1891, Brennan's response was characteristically modest. "I didn't invent anything. I just paid attention to what winter was trying to teach us." Catherine Brennan, in her own interview, offered a different perspective. "The educated men told us we'd freeze or suffocate. They had credentials and experience and absolute certainty. My husband had observation and willingness to be wrong. That made all the difference." The round hay-covered cabin stood until 1923, outlasting most conventional structures built in the same period. When it was finally dismantled, not from structural failure, but to make room for a larger farmhouse, the sod walls remained intact, The hay insulation's still functional after 36 years. The river stones from the corner firebox were salvaged and incorporated into the new home's fireplace, where they continued radiating heat for another generation. Today, visitors to the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery can see a scale model of Brennan's roundhouse, accompanied by Fitzpatrick's original temperature measurements and a placard explaining the thermal dynamics. Modern builders, rediscovering passive heating principles, occasionally cite the Brennan Round as an early example of what we now call sustainable architecture. But the deepest legacy isn't architectural, it's epistemological. The story of the round cabin reminds us that expertise, while valuable, can become a prison when it stops questioning itself. That traditional knowledge, whether from Irish ranchers or Arapaho lodges or beaver engineering, often contains solutions we've forgotten in our rush towards standardization. The neighbors laughed at Declan Brennan because his cabin violated every convention they knew. They stopped laughing when winter revealed that their conventions had been built on incomplete understanding. The round cabin didn't just stay 42 degrees warmer. It proved that dismissing unfamiliar approaches as primitive or foolish often reveals not their ignorance, but ours. In January 1887, during the worst blizzard northern Colorado had seen in a decade, one man sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves while experts froze in cabins they built with absolute confidence. The difference wasn't intelligence or resources. It was the willingness to see past what everyone knew to what actually worked. That lesson remains as relevant now as it was then. Sometimes the wisest course isn't following the experts, it's watching the beavers. If this story changed how you think about traditional knowledge and survival wisdom, smash that like button and subscribe for more forgotten frontier innovations that put modern methods to shame. And drop a comment. What old school technique do you think we've foolishly abandoned? The best answer gets featured in our next video. Don't miss out. Subscribe now. Educational note. This narrative is a historical reconstruction based on documented frontier building techniques and thermodynamics principles. While inspired by real innovations in vernacular architecture across the American West, specific characters and events are dramatized for educational purposes. Any construction project should comply with modern building codes and engineering standards. This content is intended to illustrate historical problem-solving approaches, not to serve as construction guidance.